The obligations of the seller and buyer under X works are set out in A1 to A10, B1 to B10. With X works, I want to highlight two key points. First, A2 and B2 licenses, authorizations and export or security clearance. The seller only has a duty to provide information and assistance. It is up to the buyer to obtain at its own risk and expense any export and import license, official authorizations, and to carry out all customs formalities. Second, the seller delivers when the goods are placed at the disposal of the buyer as outlined in A4 and B4, delivery, taking, delivery. However, you must note that the seller does not have any obligation to load the goods on any collecting vehicle. The obligations of the seller and buyer under FCA are set out in A1 to A10, B1 to B10. FCA is a unique Incoterm rule, as it sets out two options for the completion of delivery under A4, B4 covering delivery. Option 1. If the named place of delivery is the seller's premises, delivery is completed when the goods have been loaded on the means of transport provided by the buyer. Option 2. Delivery occurs when the goods are provided on the seller's means of transport ready for unloading at the disposal of the carrier nominated by the buyer. Another point to note regarding allocation of costs, A6, B6. The buyer must pay all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered as just outlined, other than costs of customs formalities, duties, taxes, charges payable upon export, which are payable by the seller. The obligations of the seller and buyer under CPT are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. With CPT, you need to keep in mind that there are two critical points because risk passes and costs are transferred at two different places. With respect to delivery, A4. Delivery occurs when the seller hands the goods over to the carrier contracted by the seller. But respect to allocation of costs, A6, B6, the seller pays loading, freight and unloading costs to the place of destination, which are for the seller's account under his contract of carriage. It is also noteworthy that under A5, B5, transfer of risks, the risk of loss or damage to the goods transfers from seller to buyer from the time they are delivered to the contracted carrier. The obligations of the seller and buyer under CIP are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. With CIP, it is essential to understand that under A5, B5, transfer of risks, the risk of loss or damage to the goods transfers from seller to buyer from the time they are delivered to the contracted carrier. However, under A3, B3, contracts for carriage and insurance, the seller must obtain at its own expense cargo insurance, at least with minimum cover, entitling the buyer or another party with an insurable interest claimed directly from the insurer. The insurance cover must cover at a minimum the price provided in the contract plus 10%. That is 110%, and must be in the currency of the contract. Furthermore, a point often misunderstood is elaborated at A6, B6, covering allocation of costs. The buyer must pay all costs and charges relating to the goods while in transit until their arrival at the agreed destination, unless such costs are for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. The obligations of the seller and buyer under DAT are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. An important observation is that this 2010 revision of the Incoterms rules has taken into consideration the expansion in the use of designated terminals at named ports and places of destination. I wish to draw your attention to A4, B4, delivery, taking delivery, where we see that to deliver, the seller must provide the goods unloaded, and placed at the disposal of the buyer at the named terminal at the place or port of destination. A common incorrect assumption surrounding DAT is that under this rule, the seller has an obligation to the buyer to make a contract of insurance. Take note that under DAT, A3, B3, contracts of carriage and insurance, the seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of insurance. The obligations of the seller and buyer under DAP are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. There is one essential point to grasp in connection with the DAP rule. This point is set out in A4, B4, delivery, taking delivery, where it is stipulated that the seller delivers when the goods are placed at the disposal of the buyer on the arriving means of transport ready for unloading at the named place of destination. The means of transport is not restricted. It can be any means or mode of transport. This, in fact, is the essential difference between the DAP and DAT rule. DAT includes unloading, whereas we see here that DAP is ready for unloading. The obligations of the seller and buyer under DDP are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. As we can see here, DDP is the Incoterms rule with the maximum obligations of the seller. I wish to highlight two important points that are often misunderstood. First point, even though DDP involves the maximum obligation of the seller, we can see at A4, B4, delivery, taking delivery, that the seller delivers by placing the goods at the disposal of the buyer on the arriving means of transport ready for unloading at the agreed point. So in simple terms, unloading and unloading costs are for the account of the buyer unless included in the contract of carriage agreed by the seller. The second point, often misunderstood, relates to A9, B9 in respect of inspection of goods, where it is made clear that the buyer has no obligation to the seller to pay the cost of any mandatory pre-shipment inspection mandated by the country of export or mandated by the country of import. The obligations of the seller and buyer under FAS are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. FAS is one of 4 maritime Incoterms rules where delivery occurs at a named port of shipment. Here it can be observed that at A4, B4 covering delivery, the seller delivers when the goods are placed alongside the ship nominated by the buyer at the named port of shipment. So in simple terms, the buyer is responsible for all costs from this point. Also, under A6, B6, covering allocation of costs, the seller must pay the cost of export customs formalities as well as other charges payable upon export. The obligations of the seller and buyer under FOB are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. There are 3 essential points to observe when reviewing the FOB Incoterms rule. First concerns delivery, as outlined at A4, B4, where the rule provides that the seller delivers by placing the goods on board the vessel nominated by the buyer at the port of shipment. Second concerns obligations in respect of contracts of carriage and insurance, where we can see at A3, B3 that the seller has no obligation to the buyer to make either a contract of carriage or contract of insurance. Third concerns transfer of risks, as outlined at A5, B5, where the rule provides that the buyer bears all risk of loss or damage to the goods from the time they have been delivered on board, free on board. The obligations of the seller and buyer under CFR are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. With CFR, I would like to highlight 2 points. First, the seller must contract for the carriage of goods to the named port of destination, but delivery occurs and risk transfers from seller to buyer when the goods are loaded on board the vessel at the port of shipment. A4 and B4 set out delivery obligations, and A5 and B5 deal with the transfer of risks. Second, it follows logically and is specified in A6, B6 allocation of costs that the seller pays costs, including freight, after the critical point of transfer of risk from seller to buyer. The obligations of the seller and buyer under CIF are set out in A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. Two key points to note as you review these obligations. Under CIF, the seller must contract for the carriage of the goods to a named port of destination, but delivery occurs and risk transfers from seller to buyer when the goods are loaded on board the vessel at the port of shipment. Make sure to pay special attention when reviewing A4 and B4 that sets out delivery obligations, and A5 and B5 that deal with the transfer of risks. Another point to note, the seller pays costs, including freight and insurance, after the critical point of transfer of risk from seller to buyer. A6 and B6 outline this allocation of costs.